So who do I call on first? Majority. House will be in order. Please take your conversations off the floor. Those who are conversing, please leave the floor. House will be in order. For what purposes does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for 1 minute for the purposes of inquiring of the Majority Leader the schedule for the week to come.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I now yield to my friend, Mr. McCarthy, the Majority Leader from California, for the purposes of telling us in depth the schedule for weeks to come. I yield.
Gentleman yields.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the House will meet at 2 p.m. for legislative business. Votes will be postponed until 6:30. On Tuesday and Wednesday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour and noon for legislative business. On Thursday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. Last votes of the week are expected no later than 3 p.m. On Friday, no votes are expected in the House. Mr. Speaker, the House will consider a number of suspensions next week, a complete list of which will be announced by close of business today. This list will include a series of bills to honor our nation's veterans. With Memorial Day around the corner, it is important for this House to show our appreciation to those who have defended our freedoms, especially the men and women who made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of our nation. Mr. Speaker, next week the House is combating human trafficking and Child Protection Week. In addition to a series of suspensions, the House will consider H.R. 1973, the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse Act, sponsored by Representative Susan Brooks. This bill would require prompt reporting of suspected cases of abuse, as well as implementation of procedures for addressing such allegations. We will also consider H.R. 1761, the Protecting Against Child Exploitation Act, sponsored by Representative Mike Johnson. This bill would protect victims of sexual abuse by ensuring that predators who send explicit content are subject to appropriate punishment. Mr. Speaker, human trafficking is an incredulous, serious issue in our nation. With the passage of these bipartisan bills, we will show our continued commitment to ending this modern-day form of slavery while supporting and assisting all survivors. Now, lastly, Mr. Speaker, the House will consider H.R. 953, the Reducing Regulatory Burdens Act, sponsored by Representative Bob Gibbs. Now, my district is home to many hardworking farmers, so I know this issue quite well. This bill will reduce red tape that makes it more costly for farmers to protect their crops and our nation's food supply. In addition, the CDC reports that there are still 119 cases of individuals with Zika in the United States and 495 cases in U.S. territories. With the summer season approaching, this bill will ensure we can use pesticides to control mosquitoes. Now, finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to take a moment to thank a true public servant. Next week, Brian Cooper will retire from the House Parliamentarian's office after 35 years on Capitol Hill. Brian is a professional in every sense of the word. Much of his work is done behind the scenes, but it has not gone unnoticed. From timekeeping to processing bills to preparing for joint sessions, Brian has made sure this body works in an orderly and fair way. Now, it is my understanding that even my predecessor, Bill Thomas, could not challenge Brian's timekeeping. On behalf of all those on this side of the aisle, we wish you well in your retirement, Brian, and from a very grateful nation for your service. I am sure you are ready to trade late nights on this floor for late nights watching the Orioles play baseball. With that, I yield to my friend.
I thank the gentleman from California, and I want to join him in thanking our colleague Brian Cooper. Now, I'm not sure that, Brian, that I adopt the sentiments of the Majority Leader with respect to what Mr. Thomas could and could not do. Apparently, he chose not to, and that's good. But Brian Cooper, we want to thank you for your service to this House. 3.5 decades of service to this House. 3.5 decades of service to this House in a role that most people, including members of this House, would not recognize, but that is critically important to the good management and flow of the people's business through this House. As the Majority Leader referenced, he will be continuing to root from Baltimore. So he's a Marylander, and we're very proud of him, and I want to thank him for his service and wish him the very best in the days ahead. And I now will go to the schedule. By law, under the Budget Control Act, a budget is supposed to be brought to this floor on April 15th. The Majority Leader would quickly observe that neither Democrats nor Republicans have always met that deadline. However, we are unusually late in the budget process, in my view, and despite months of promising to return to regular order, we have not yet done so as it relates to the budget, and the budget has not been marked up in committee, Mr. Speaker. Monday marked the statutory date by which the Appropriations Committee no longer has to wait to bring bills to the floor of the House because the majority has failed to meet its obligation to pass a budget on time. Now, again, I want to quickly note that both parties have failed to meet that deadline in times past. But I cannot remember us being as late in this session in getting to the appropriations process, because there really has been no direction from the administration as to what their budget priorities should be, would be, other than the so-called skinny budget that was sent down, which in my view almost every member of Congress thought was a totally unrealistic, unadoptable, and unworthy budget priority document. And if it were to be adopted, the security of the United States, both abroad and at home, would be put at substantial risk. So, Mr. Majority Leader, can you provide some indication? I know it's not on the floor next week, and I want to say that I join with the Majority Leader. The issue of human trafficking is one of the critical issues that confronts us as a country and the global community. It puts millions of young women and young men at risk, and not so young men and women at risk on a daily basis. It is appropriate that we deal with this issue. Hopefully we will deal with it, as the Majority Leader said, in a bipartisan fashion, and that we will produce more effective ways to stop and to hold accountable those who put human beings at risk by human slavery. But can the gentleman tell me when the Budget Committee will mark up a budget and when we will have such a budget considered on the floor? And I yield to my friend.
Well, I thank my friend for yielding, and as my friend knows, we do expect to receive the formal budget request from the President next week, which, as my friend also knows, that is common for the first year of a new administration. Now, as the gentleman said that maybe this is later, but this is the latest in the history of America that any president has had to wait for a cabinet. And it's always helpful. He still has many more people to be filled and confirmed, and as that progresses, I think actions will be able to move forward even faster. But as in tradition, the Budget Committee has announced its intention to host OMB Director Mick Mulvaney, as the gentleman knows, a former colleague here, to answer questions from members who may have about the President's budget request following its release. This will kick off the regular order process of the committee's work on crafting an FY18 budget resolution. Likewise, with appropriations, the committee is looking forward to marking up bills through regular order. Now, as soon as action is scheduled for the floor, The gentleman will know that I will notify all members. I thank him and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With respect to the appropriations process, as the gentleman knows, there are 12 discrete appropriation bills dealing with national security and domestic spending. Can the gentleman tell me whether or not we still intend to consider on a timely basis, discreetly, that is, one at a time, the 12 appropriation bills? I don't think any of them have been marked up as of this point in time. Obviously, not having a budget would preclude that from happening. I understand that. But as the gentleman knows, and I know from experience of serving on the appropriation process that, frankly, it was at the beginning of this month, historically, that we would start to mark up appropriation bills with the intent to use much of June and July for the purposes of passing appropriation bills so that we might send them to the Senate for consideration and have some chance of getting them done prior to the expiration of the fiscal year on September 30th. Does the gentleman anticipate that we will be considering separately the 12 appropriation bills between now and the August break? And I yield to my friend.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The gentleman will be happy to know that Appropriations has already held 47 hearings dealing with FY18. So as we receive the President's budget and able to ask questions to the OMB director, we will continue to move forward. But it is our intention always to go through regular order and in all cases, if possible, individually down onto the floor. I yield back.
Well, I hope that we do, in fact, get that done. Now, Mr. Leader, I was shocked yesterday to learn that the process that, from my perspective and our side's perspective, was extraordinarily accelerated, undermining the opportunity for careful and thorough consideration. The bill that is known as the American Health Care Act, or otherwise known as the bill to attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That bill, as the gentleman knows, was introduced on March 6th. It had not a single hearing and was marked up less than 2 full days later in the Ways and Means Committee on March 8th. It was marked up on March 8th and 9th in the Energy and Commerce Committee. In the Budget Committee on March 16th, on the Rules Committee on March 22nd, and brought to the floor with a CBO score on March 23rd. In other words, in my view, Mr. Speaker, moved so quickly that no one could have given it thoughtful consideration. In fact, Mr. Speaker, on March 24th, that bill was brought to the floor, was subjected to some debate, and then was pulled. The judgment was made that apparently it was not ready for prime time. That bill was then brought back to the floor some 2+ weeks, about 2 weeks later, on Thursday, May 4th of this year. It was passed on a Thursday, notwithstanding the fact it had not been noted for consideration on Thursday at the beginning of the week or in the week prior. It passed on a vote of 217 to 213, with a significant number of Republicans voting against it, and a significant number of Republicans who voted for it saying, no, I haven't read the bill, in response to inquiries from the press. That afternoon, Mr. Speaker, there were buses out in front of the Capitol to take my Republican colleagues down to the White House to cheer its passage. An accomplishment of what our Republican colleagues had pledged for 6 years. Mr. Speaker, you can imagine my shock, chagrin, and surprise when I learned yesterday that bill has not gone to the Senate. Apparently, it's gone from one chair to maybe the other chair in the desk before me. It has been held, Mr. Speaker. It has been held because there was no CBO score to ensure that, in fact, it complied with the rules. A lot of talk about regular order, Mr. Speaker. So the bill that was cheered at the White House, the president saying, "I'm so glad this passed," apparently may not have passed this House in a form that is consistent with the rules. And so, my colleagues, I want you to know that you may have think you passed the bill, but it is still here 2 weeks later. I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, why we couldn't have waited for a CBO score, other than the political imperative of going home and having members be able to say, "We passed the bill." When might we pass this bill? Is the bill going to have another hearing? Are we going to wait for the CBO score? And will another vote be necessary to again confirm the 217 to 213 votes? And I will not ask you whether or not you think you still have 217 votes, but let me ask you, when might this bill be considered again on this floor, and when might this bill go to the United States Senate, as everybody thought it had on the 4th of May? And I yield to my friend, the Majority Leader, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank him for his long question. But let me first...
But he got the point, I'm sure.
Let me answer the number of points you have made, because I want history to be written correctly. First of all, you were shocked. I don't know why you were shocked. I thought you were going to say you were shocked that that exact same week, when you read the paper, that 94 counties out of 99 in Iowa would have no health care if Obamacare continued to go forward. I thought that would have shocked you. Then when you wanted to put dates down and talk about hearings, we had more than 113 hearings. That's more than the number of hearings you had for Obamacare. Our bill is less than 150 pages. That's thousands of pages less than Obamacare. You talk of CBO, you knowingly know that CBO scored this bill, but those 8 pages of amendment you were shocked by. You should be shocked to know the rules of the House. Democrats asked that they change the name to have some hashtag. We spent hours on that, but we did that because we believed that was important to you. Now, our bill eliminates the many taxes and mandates of Obamacare. It gives patients enhanced tools to take control of their own health care decisions. And it expands choice for Americans. So yes, I am shocked every day I read the paper that more Americans are going to lose their health care if Obamacare stays where it is. Or that people even pay higher. Because I remember the promise the president made that our premiums would go down, or we could keep our own doctor, which so many thousands of Americans found out to be a lie. So, Mr. Speaker, So yes, if I go to Iowa, I go to Tennessee, those 16 counties there that will no longer have health care. Or what about Aetna? You didn't even mention them pulling out of Virginia. You weren't shocked by that either. But you know what? 8 pages of amendments that stayed out there for everybody to read, not more than 2,000. Yes, we will wait till the CBO finishes scoring the amendments and send it to the Senate. Yes, we know what's in those amendments, just as everybody else had the opportunity to read them, just as we went through the Rules Committee. So there's lots of things to be shocked.
Mr. Speaker, we've had a similar conversation before, and the Majority Leader would love to rely on the hearings that were held before this bill that we passed was introduced. The 113 hearings were on the repeal. This bill, as surely the Majority Leader knows, and members who voted on it, was not repeal. It does not repeal. Now, it is said that the gentleman is and so insurers have, in fact, lost confidence that the marketplace will be stable, an absolutely critical component of pricing their product correctly. And the administration continues, as does the House itself and the Republican leadership in the Senate, continue to undermine the confidence that there will be a market. So yes, Mr. Speaker, the Majority Leader is correct. The insurance market is not as stable, but almost everybody who speaks to that, and there's a Los Angeles Times story today, relatively lengthy on that, in terms of what steps the administration has taken from the very beginning, starting with IRS, don't worry about the mandate. Don't worry about the fact you have insurance. It's like the automobile people saying, don't worry about having automobile insurance. There's going to be no penalty. Well, if that was the case, I'll bet you a lot of people would not have automobile insurance, and if they hit you, I think there's some additional reasons, because they're not sure that they're complying with the Byrd rule in the United States Senate, and they've got to see. So they may have to pass this again, to which the Majority Leader did not address himself. But there was no reason not to wait other than politics, other than to have those buses go down to the Capitol and cheer one another. They had no idea what CBO is going to come up with next week. Okay. So they did not wait, consistent with the rules. We should have had a score when we passed the bill. But that was not convenient for the politics of repeal. Now, the Majority Leader, Mr. Speaker, has not told me when we're going to consider that bill again, or if we're going to need to consider that bill again. And perhaps the honest answer is the majority leader does not have that knowledge as to whether he's going to have to bring that bill to the floor again, because he's going to need the CBO score to make that determination. I understand that. And we should have waited, Mr. Speaker, not rushed to judgment. And he talks about hearings. There were no hearings on this bill. One reason there were no hearings on these bills, because my Republican colleagues have been having town meetings and they're hearing about the public's thoughts about their bill. And some of them are not having town meetings because they don't want to hear any more than they wanted to have hearings here in the House to hear what the public thought. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm hoping that the majority leader will be able to perhaps at some point in time in the relatively near future give us a clear picture as to when we may either consider this bill again or when we're going to send it to the United States Senate, flawed though it may be. I will be glad to yield to my friend, the majority leader, if he'd like to say something further. If not, I will yield back.
No,
I yield to my friend.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'm actually shocked. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. But did you actually make the argument that those 94 counties out of 99 in Iowa pulled out just because we were bringing a bill up? Did you actually believe the 18 out of 23 co-ops that were given more than $2 billion pulled out because somehow they knew we'd probably capture the White House too and keep the Senate and the House? So that's why it failed? Or maybe those 16 counties in Tennessee that were told almost a year ago that they wouldn't have health care the next year. Somehow people could look into the future, and just because a Republican took office, that's who we're going to blame? I know President Bush is no longer here, but do we continue to have to put blame on others instead of having the facts? So let's talk about a few things. Now let's be clear of what you asked me earlier, because I apologize, I got off, you had a lot of adjectives out there, I wanted to make sure I had answered them all, but I am very confident this bill will hit the mark for reconciliation and it will move across the aisle over to the other chambers. Now you talk about the House, if you're going to blame us for everything, let's go to facts. And they're not my facts. There's recently a report from Quorum. Now this is a data analysis company in DC. These are bright young people, a lot of them Stanford grads. Here are the facts, because they just went and analyzed the first 100 days. 100 days, President Trump signed 30 pieces of legislation into law. Now that's more than President Obama, Bush, Clinton, or H.W. Bush signed in their first 100 days. Only once before in history has a Congressional Review Act signed into law. Only one. Now we have 14 overturned regulations through the Congressional Review Act, saving Americans $3.7 billion in regulatory cost and 4.2 million hours in filling out paperwork. Now my favorite quote of this report: this House, the one we stand in today, passed 103 bills out of this chamber, edging out former Speaker Pelosi's House as the most productive during the first 100 days of a new presidency since H.W. Bush. Now just this week we passed the Modernizing Government Technology Act, and I do thank my friend for his hard work on this. Nation in the face of the earth. That it was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. that yes, we're not going to blame others for our problems. And if you wanted to go along that line, I can go all the things that were promised in more than 2,000 pages of Obamacare. But you know what? Today I live currently. And what I currently see, 18 of the 23 co-ops have collapsed. And the current law says we're going to penalize the people who actually paid the co-ops to get their health care, but they have no health care to get. I'm going to read the facts where more Americans took the penalty or the exemption than actually signed up for Obamacare. That prior to a bill even passing on this floor, something we promised for 6 years, that a number of companies pulled out because it was not working. But the biggest shock I had all week is somehow it's our fault. I could not look an American in the eye knowing the knowledge that we all have. I don't care what party you're in. You don't sit on a carpet that has red on one side and blue on the other. This is the American house. You know people are hurting. You know people have lost their doctors. You know they're pulling out of these counties. Don't make up some political spin to make yourself feel better for some vote. We promised we would repeal Obamacare and give people greater choice. That's what we did. You disagreed with it? Disagree with it. But don't lay blame where it's not true. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I listened to his comments with interest. I want to touch on a number of comments he made, however. First of all, in a very partisan vote, from 3 a.m. in the morning until 6 a.m. in the morning, my Republican colleagues passed a bill in a partisan fashion. There were a few Democrats, not many, that and then we took the majority. And what did we do, Mr. Speaker? Colleagues did, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the Affordable Care Act. And in fact, the Affordable Care Act, as my friend knows, in polling now shows that over 55% of Americans believe that the Affordable Care Act ought to be kept, and 75% of them, 3 out of 4 Americans, believe we ought to fix the Affordable Care Act, not repeal it. That has not changed, however, the Republicans' attempt and rhetoric to repeal.
I won't take it.
Now, there were a number of things that the Republicans did, contrary to what we did with respect to the prescription drug bill for seniors, to undermine and create this situation of which the majority leader speaks, where there are some insurance companies that have pulled out, that are not doing as well as they should have, and we wanted them to have. One thing, many Republican governors refused to join the Medicaid expansion program, adversely affecting millions and millions and millions of Americans. Secondly, they did not fund the risk corridors. We knew when you established this program that there were going to be a very tough time
It's not true.
Making valid judgments on what costs were going to be. But 2 years into this program, we did not fund it. The co-ops also did not receive the support that was contemplated by the statute. The cost-sharing subsidies the administration has put at risk Now, we were assured just before the bill passed that, oh no, we're going to pay for the cost-sharing subsidies. But the Republicans, Mr. Speaker, filed suit. And the court said, oh no, you have to appropriate those monies on the cost-sharing subsidies. The majority leader knows, certainly everybody on the Energy and Commerce knows, and every member ought to know, without those subsidies, the insurance companies will have mispriced their product for deductibles and copays in particular. So that, Mr. Speaker, is what I speak of in terms of the actions that have been taken over the last 6 years to undermine the confidence of the marketplace. And everybody knows that confidence is an important factor in any marketplace. Now, we can, I'm sure we're going to debate this again. Mr. Speaker, again, I would simply ask, is this bill coming back to the House? Will we expect another vote on it? The CBO report is due next week, and I believe that if, in fact, we're going to schedule that, we ought to at least be given notice that that either is or may be a piece of legislation that will be on the floor next week prior to our break for the Memorial Day break. And I yield to my friend.
Well, as I said earlier, this is a technical issue. I have all the confidence in the world. The CBO score will come back, we'll meet the reconciliation number, and we'll move it to the Senate. Now, if my colleague wants to schedule something, I'll schedule with you. We can walk the bill over there together, because I believe the American people are waiting for it. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
Oh, do I too? We don't have Mr. Speaker. Where's the man? What is it? Wait a minute, does someone have it?
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourn to meet at 2 p.m. on Monday next, and that the order of the House regarding morning hour debate not apply on that day.
Without objection.
Oh.
The Chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, in the warm waters off Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas, and my beloved Florida, a reef assassin lurks. Lionfish are an invasive species with no predators, huge appetites, and exploding populations. Just one female lionfish will release 10 million eggs during her lifetime, and each lionfish can eat 65 juvenile reef fish in one meal. NOAA ecologists call the lionfish one of the greatest threats of the century to reefs. Reefs support tourism, recreational fishing, commercial fishing, and our way of life. Lionfish threaten a multi-billion-dollar reef economy. To date, all efforts to eradicate the lionfish have failed. Bounty programs are uneconomical, and rodeos, while helpful, are unsustainable. Today, I filed legislation to turn the tables on the lionfish. Our proposition is simple. Fishermen who slay 100 lionfish can earn one tag to fish red snapper, gag grouper, triggerfish, or amberjack whenever they want. Anyone who kills 100 lionfish has done their part to save hundreds, if not thousands, of coveted reef fish. The Reef Assassin Act costs no money and uses our natural resources to protect our natural resources. I encourage my colleagues to support the Reef Assassin Act, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise? Seek recognition. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate Leighton Durham IV of Dallas, Texas, as he celebrates with his family his selection of Eagle Scout. The Boy Scouts of America has a long tradition of preparing young men for leadership, and the Eagle Scout Award recognizes the highest rank within that program. Only 4% of Boy Scouts are granted this recognition, and after a lengthy review process, which includes the verification of 21 merit badges, a demonstrated Spirit Scout, and a youth-led service project. For Leighton, his involvement in the service began when he was only 8 years old. Since then, the Boy Scouts program has helped foster a sense of service and leadership. This past year, as part of his Eagle Scout project, Leighton led efforts to refurbish a previously neglected classroom at the Tyler Street United Methodist Church in Oak Cliff. As a result of Leighton's project, the classroom is now in use for middle school youth. Please join me in congratulating Leighton in his latest achievement. I look forward to seeing your continued leadership in our community. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Mr. Walter Parrish, a 98-year-old World War II veteran in Georgia's 1st Congressional District. Mr. Parrish was born on March 12, 1919, less than 6 months after the end of World War I. Originally from New Jersey, Mr. Parrish served 5 years in the Navy as a signalman on destroyer ships, where he used lamps and visual objects to communicate with others in the water. Mr. Parrish served both in the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters of the war, and is undoubted that his role was crucial to the success of his shipmates. Although winning World War II is a major accomplishment, Mr. Parrish enjoyed another important milestone during the war when he married his wife. He asked her hand in marriage on a Sunday and married her less than a week later on Wednesday. Mr. Parrish, thank you for your service to our country, and I hope your inspiring life will serve as a lesson for all those who know your story. With Memorial Day approaching, I encourage everyone in our nation to take time to reflect on the sacrifices of our veterans, thank our nation's veterans, and understand the importance of their service. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman's, without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning to recognize the 2nd anniversary of the devastating Refugio oil spill off the Gaviota coast in my district. I remember all too well the horrifying sights and smells when over 100,000 barrels of crude oil poured from the Plains All-American pipeline rupture. Our local funds were stretched as we mounted our cleanup effort that ended up costing over $100 million. The full extent of the damage to our local economy and environment and to our region won't be fully known for years. I was pleased that President Obama signed into law last year the Safe Pipes Act, directing the Department of Transportation pipeline
On the morning of October 31st, 2016, Deputy Williams put on his uniform, climbed into his patrol car, heading to the job he loved. Deputy Williams was tragically killed in a collision that morning. Deputy Williams joined the Taylor County Sheriff's Department in May of 2015 and was promoted to officer in charge, serving as his sergeant's second in command. He dedicated his life to law enforcement. For him, it was not just a job, it was a calling. the National Peace Officers Memorial Service in Washington, a fitting reminder that his heroism will not be forgotten.
Makes our businesses more competitive and gives relief to our working families. President Trump's plan, if you can call it that, is not the answer. According to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Trump's plan will cost $5.5 trillion over the next 10 years. Instead of targeting relief to the deserving middle class, President Trump wants to give big breaks to the wealthiest Americans, and it's time to stop pretending that tax cuts that favor the wealthy somehow pay for themselves. They don't. Conservative economist Greg Mankiw has said that only 1/3 of the cost of tax cuts is recouped from growth. So Trump's tax plan would actually be paid for by blowing up the national debt. That will crowd out investment, hurt economic growth, which is the opposite of what we want. We have to do better for working Americans, and I want to express my interest in working with members of both sides of the aisle to do just that. Thank you. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I request permission to address the House and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in honor of National Police Week, an opportunity to recognize the brave men and women in blue. This week is meaningful to me and my family, for my oldest son is a police officer in Michigan, and I could not be more proud of him and his service. Too often we take for granted those every day who put on a badge and a vest to protect us and communities. Events across this country have been politicized and stress the relationship between law enforcement and their communities. Let us not have politics overwhelm the dedication and commitment of our men and women in blue. Our lives, and indeed our freedoms, are safeguarded by the thin blue line. We owe the men and women in uniform, those who put themselves at risk every day, a simple thank you and simply our respect. Mr. Speaker, I rise to give police officers at our doors, the officers throughout our community, and my son a simple thank you. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the Republican health care bill is a giant step backwards. It will leave millions of Americans without any insurance and many more paying more money for less coverage. Worse, it will reduce protections requiring insurers to treat fairly those of us with pre-existing conditions. Instead of this disastrous plan, we should be working together to improve health care, building on the progress of the ACA and finding solutions to what isn't working. Let me offer one example. I recently introduced the Common Sense Employer Notification of Special Enrollment Act, or Common Sense Act. This bill would require employers to inform people leaving a job that they not only qualify for COBRA, but also qualify for a special enrollment period to purchase insurance on the ACA marketplace or enroll in Medicare, which is often less expensive than COBRA. Mr. Speaker, this bill will help Americans save money and seniors avoid last-minute enrollment penalties. I urge my colleagues to support the Common Sense Act and join me in finding common sense ways to improve our health care, not to dismantle it. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to express my sincere thanks to all the men and women who serve and have served in law enforcement in the state of Colorado. These men and women put themselves in harm's way to protect the citizens of our great state. I would like to especially recognize the Aurora, Littleton, Greenwood Village, and Brighton Police Departments, as well as the Arapahoe, Douglas, and Adams County Sheriff's Departments for their tireless work in doing their best to keep our communities safe. I am proud to say that these municipal police and county sheriff's departments within the 6th Congressional District of Colorado are exceptional and should be recognized for their extraordinary public service. These men and women of law enforcement are dedicated to public safety, and in honor of the National Law Enforcement Week, I would like to thank not only those who serve in law enforcement in the state of Colorado, but all those who serve across our country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
address the House floor.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in honor of Police Week and to say thank you to the men and women in New Jersey and in our country who keep our communities safe, and especially those who, and pay honor especially to those who pay the ultimate price in their efforts to do so. Sadly, this year alone, we've lost 48 police officers in the line of duty across the United States. We cannot repay the debt our communities owe to these heroes and to their families. But we can start by expressing appreciation for their bravery, dedication, and service, and making sure that law enforcement knows that they have our full support. Our police officers and all first responders can protect us and themselves with the resources they need to do their jobs safely and effectively. Not only do police protect us from criminals, but they are on the front lines of the war on terror, especially as we've seen the rise of homegrown and lone wolf terror after 9/11. To close, I want to reiterate my deep appreciation for the work of local, county, and state police officers in my district, in New Jersey, and across our country who keep our communities safe. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in honor of the men and women in law enforcement who put their lives on the line day and night protecting our communities, like my nephew, Ethan Meehan. And as we close this year's Police Week, I'd like to pay particular tribute to the law enforcement personnel who have been killed or wounded in the line of duty, like Officer Christopher this last year, Pennsylvania State Trooper Eugene Weaver, Cannonsburg Patrolman Scott Basham, Pennsylvania Corrections Officer David Weaver, and Luzerne County Corrections Officer Christopher Moles. We thank them for their service. We're indebted for their sacrifice. We honor their memories, and our thoughts and prayers are with their families. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Seeking unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. President Trump is headed to Saudi Arabia today, which is an authoritarian theocratic state which bans any criticism of the government and executes people or imprisons them for allegedly insulting Islam. In just a few weeks ago, a Saudi man, Ahmad al-Shamri, who's in his early 20s, was sentenced to death for atheism and apostasy. Another Saudi man, Raif Badawi, a few years ago was sentenced to serve 10 years in prison, to suffer 1,000 lashes, and to pay 1 million Saudi royals for insulting Islam, simply for advocating secular thought and the separation of church and state. There are dozens of Saudis languishing in prison for blasphemy, apostasy, heresy, sorcery, witchcraft, and other imaginary offenses. Mr. Trump, please use at least 2 minutes of your time while you're in Saudi Arabia to plead with the rulers there to release all religious prisoners and stop executing and incarcerating people for these imaginary religious crimes in the 21st century. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, you're reminded to address your remarks to the chair. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as the hot Texas sun set in the west last night, about 10 o'clock, the brave first responders of the San Antonio Fire Department answered the alarms as a strip mall went up in a fiery inferno. 61 fire trucks with lights and sirens sped to the scene. The firefighters dashed into the buildings performing a search and recovery operation, making sure no one was there. As the fire grew, the intense smoke and heat became suffocating. 2 firefighters were injured, but their lives were saved by other firefighters. But firefighter Scott Dean was trapped in the inferno. This 6-year veteran of the force, his life was stolen by the hellish blaze. He gave his life while saving others from harm. Texas lost another one of its finest last night. Firefighters such as Scott Dean are a rare and tenacious breed. They are the American breed. They run into the flames that everyone else desperately flees from. Firefighters restore order from chaos, answering the alarm. Mr. Speaker, they always answer the alarm. It has been said that all people are created equal, but a few turn out to be firefighters. One of those rare breed was firefighter Scott Dean. So the last alarm has sounded for Scott Dean. He answered the call, and he gave it all for the people of San Antonio, Texas. And that's just the way it is. I'll yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Seek permission to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize the 75th anniversary of the National Association of Home Builders. For 3/4 of a century, the NAHB has been fighting for homeowners, home builders, and communities across this country. Today, the Federation includes over 700 local and state home builders associations who are committed to fostering pro-growth climate and sensible, cost-effective housing policies. How do I know? Because my family has been involved in our local chapter for decades. The NAHB has long supported the builders who create beautiful homes in West Michigan, my home, as well as across the nation. Many of these builders are small businessmen and women that represent the backbone of the American economy. By standing up to regulatory overreach and promoting a pro-growth environment, the NAHB is helping these entrepreneurial small businesses to have a voice. Thanks in part to the efforts of the NAHB, builders and consumers throughout the country are back on their feet. Housing production has increased, and builders are increasingly confident in the market. I ask my colleagues to join me in honoring the National Association of Home Builders as they work to keep the home building industry moving forward. And congratulations to those 75 years.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it is a distinct honor to rise today to recognize National Police Week, honoring our heroes of the Thin Blue Line. During this week each year, our nation joins together to honor our brave men and women in blue. In their mission to serve and protect, our law enforcement officers put their lives on the line each day, keeping our families and our communities safe from harm. Day in and day out, we witness the countless sacrifices made by the men and women who serve as our front line of defense here at home. We stand to recognize their service this week. We also pay tribute to those who have tragically lost their lives in the line of duty. Their bravery and sacrifice will never be forgotten. I would like to specifically thank the dedicated officers serving throughout the state of New York, from the New York State Troopers to the county sheriffs, and for our local law enforcement. The heroism and bravery of the men and women in the blue continues to inspire us all. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this week, along with Congressman Crowley, we reintroduced the Bike to Work Act. And as an avid biker myself, I'm thrilled to bring forth an initiative that encourages more biking. This is fitting given that today is National Bike to Work Day. This bipartisan legislation we've introduced will allow workers to use their pre-tax commuter benefits for bike share programs, just as they already can do for other forms of transportation. According to one report, from 2000 to 2013, the number of bicycle commuters grew by more than 62%. And as these programs grow, putting them on equal footing with other modes of transportation that the commuters use to get to and from work is important. Bike sharing is very popular in Minnesota, and through this initiative we can ensure that more Americans have the opportunity to get to work with more flexibility and more convenience, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas seek recognition?
Seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a special week in the United States, here in our capital and across the country. This was National Police Week. And so I rise to honor our men and women in service across our country who wear the uniform every day, our first responders, but our police officers who rush to trouble as opposed to running from it, who put themselves in harm's way to keep us safe. Every day they get up and keep our families safe and our community safe. They are our heroes. And so this week, Mr. Speaker, Congress welcomed many of these policemen and women and their families to D.C. to recognize them for their heroism and to remember those who we have lost. In Kansas, we are all too aware of the sacrifices that law enforcement makes to keep us safe. Brad Lancaster, Dave Melton, and Brandon Collins all made the ultimate sacrifice over the last year in my district alone, and they are on my mind this week and each and every day, along with the other fallen officers across our country. Mr. Speaker, let us never forget the selflessness and bravery of police officers around the country who work tirelessly each and every day to enforce our laws, protect our communities, and save lives. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Curbelo of Florida after 3:30 p.m. on Thursday, May 18th, and for the balance of the week.
Without objection, the request is granted. Does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I request unanimous consent to revise and extend all members' remarks made during this special order.
Without objection. The gentleman have an additional unanimous consent request?
I do.
Oh, please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, adjourn to meet on Monday, May 22nd, 2017, when it shall convene at noon for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business.
Without objection, so ordered. The Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to recognize KBTX TV, who on May 22nd will be celebrating 60 years of service to the Brazos Valley of Texas. In 1957, KBTX began broadcasting from a 4-room brick studio on East 29th Street in Bryan, Texas. Today, the studio is still located at the same location, but just like the surrounding area, it has grown immensely. Starting out, KBTX was both a CBS and an ABC affiliate. In 1984, they became a CBS affiliate exclusively. The station prides itself on its commitment and dedication to responsible reporting and community involvement. Fittingly, the station's slogan is, "The people you know, the news you trust." KBTX has set the standard for television and news in the Brazos Valley. They were the first television station in the Brazos Valley, and over the past 60 years, they have had many more impressive firsts in the Brazos Valley, which include the following. The first television station capable of color transmission and the use of videotape. The first television station to use color news film. The first to cover live sports, news, and weather, as well as community events using remote live trucks and cameras with out-of-studio editing capabilities. The first television station with Doppler radar, the first 24-hour television station, and the first commercial television station to broadcast in high definition. The KBTX News and Creative Services teams have also received many prestigious awards, which include the following: multiple Lone Star Emmys, multiple Telly Awards, multiple Texas Associated Press Broadcasters Awards, including the 2013 TAPB Overall Excellence in Television Award, multiple Addy Awards, and the Edward R. Murrow Award in 2013. I would like to congratulate KBTX TV on all of their achievements and for their 60 years of service to the Brazos Valley. It is an honor for me to represent in Congress such a great team and a pillar for our community. As I close these remarks, I ask everyone to continue praying for our country and for our military and first responders who selflessly serve and sacrifice to protect us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to honor J.B. Owen Jr. of Woodway, Texas, who passed away on March 5, 2017. J.B. was born in Mathis, Texas on November 19, 1928. He attended grade school in this small community with just 3 other students. Upon graduation from Mathis High School, J.B. went to Southwest Texas State University in San Marcos, where he would go on to earn a Bachelor of Business Administration in General Business.
He began his career by teaching business classes in Dilley, Texas, before a diagnosis of tuberculosis landed him in the hospital for 15 months. Thankfully, JB made a full recovery and set out to become an insurance agent with Texas Farm Bureau Insurance Company. JB was an exemplary leader at Farm Bureau for 41 years before his retirement in 1992. In 1965, JB married Lillian Holler Rector, known as Lil, a Georgia peach he met on a blind date with the help of a coworker. In their 50-plus years of marriage, Lil and JB raised 3 children, Richard, Holly, and JB III. They were blessed with 9 grandchildren, including triplets who were born in 2001. Along with being loving grandparents, JB and Lil enjoyed traveling both in Texas and beyond. JB is recognized as an exemplary steward for the greater Waco community. He was an active volunteer and community member, serving on the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Community Development Board. He also served as an elder at Highland Baptist Church and taught Sunday school for 35 years. JB served as the president of the Northwest Waco Rotary Club, the president of the Harlingen PTA, and as president of Kids & Co., a child care center. He was also a member of Gideon's International, a Christian business association. Mr. Speaker, J.B. Owen worked tirelessly to better our Central Texas and Waco communities. He is loved by his city and certainly left an enduring impression on Central Texas. He will be forever remembered as a great philanthropist, community member, husband, father, grandfather, and friend. My wife Gina and I offer our deepest and heartfelt condolences to the Owen family. We also lift up his wife Lil and the family and friends of J.B. Owen Jr. in our prayers. I've requested the United States flag be flown over the United States Capitol to honor the life and legacy of J.B. Owen Jr. As I close these remarks, I urge all Americans to continue praying for our country during these difficult times, for our military men and women, and for our first responders who protect us here at home.